we want to have students understand this economic aspect, that extractive industries really defined the Gilded Age, right? And that as they developed, they brought in more wealth, more people, more ideas that paved the way for the service industries, for the defense industries that really defined California in the 20th century. These are topics that we'll, of course, cover also in this unit. And as students grasp the economic strand of California history, then they can better understand the politics in any given era. For instance, by learning about the Southern Pacific Railroad during the Gilded Age, when the company controlled the freight service, the passenger service, as well as the bulk of ocean transport, river transport, owned 11% of all land in the state, then they can understand, students can better understand how the average citizen felt at the mercy of this juggernaut, right, which could set arbitrary freight rates, which could set steep land prices, and how this very much drove the politics of this era. In fact, it shaped the Second California Constitution of 1879, and it is representative of this class conflict in the Gilded Age. The National Economic Depression of the 1870s certainly heightened the strife between labor and capital. It's a depression that happened even a little earlier in California with the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869. Here's a slightly blurry, but you can get the extent, the reach of the Central Pacific and the Southern Pacific throughout the West and California very much so. When the Continental Railroad met in Utah, what happened was the California markets, of course, are flooded with goods that are reaching it, as well as thousands of Chinese laborers who had laid tracks out into Utah are returning into California and entering back into the labor market. So here is where students can see an important intersection between economics and race, as non-Chinese laborers advocated strongly for an end to Chinese immigration. Certainly, Bill has covered this, how the laborers resented this competition with the Chinese and managed to secure the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. But this is not to say that prejudice and racism did not play a part in the Chinese Exclusion Act. This sort of slide is indicative of the time with extreme racial stereotypes that are being promoted. And we can see what we want students to understand is that race and racism alone, without the broader economic context, cannot explain something like the Chinese Exclusion Act, just as it cannot explain the Watts riots in the 20th century or contemporary immigration debates, right? That there are many strands here that need to be grappled with. So we believe that by developing the interrelatedness of these strands, students will gain a more complete and nuanced understanding of their state. And we feel that these strands lend themselves well to promoting key skills among the students, such as understanding cause and effect, or understanding perspective and point of view. Hydraulic mining provides another good example that's particularly relevant for understanding cause and effect. Students are familiar with the gold rush story and probably have a fairly good insight into the story of race, into the story of the economics of the gold rush. But by developing the later gold rush story, by going forward with hydraulic mining, we want students to understand that what began as a collection of individuals who are hoping to strike it rich soon led to the exhaustion of the placer gold deposits and the development into an industry run by hydraulic mining companies. So that by the mid-1850s, the most efficient gold mining relied on water cannons that are spewing enormous amounts of water at the mountainsides to expose the tertiary bedrock. And it required so much infrastructure, well beyond what an individual miner would be able to establish himself. So by the by the 1880s, hydraulic mining companies employed 20,000 people who were working for wages, right? And so we see the morphing of a familiar and distinctive California story of the gold rush, right, into an industrial story with wage labor, investment of capital, employees and employers. But this is, of course, only part of the story. Another key part of telling any story about hydraulic mining would be the environmental impact of it. As you can see here, this is extreme. Ultimately, these water cannons are diverting water flows, denuding the mountainsides, contaminating rivers with mercury, clogging rivers with debris. What is ultimately happening is the sediment that's washed down from the mountains actually raises riverbeds, causes flooding, threatens ship navigation because the rivers are so shallow. So here's where we want to have students consider the diverse concerns and interests of the various economic players of the time in order to understand perspective, right? So by asking them to consider things such as what environmental costs were deemed acceptable in this time period and how would different industries interpret such an accounting. This lesson will guide students to the understanding that mining interests took these environmental costs as acceptable or as inevitable, just as the timber industry, right, felt that this was part of their operation. This was the natural course of events and largely supported by society in the 19th century. While we also want to consider that these particular environmental costs, very specific ones, the debris, the pollution, the shallow riverbeds, the flooding, were not acceptable to the growing commercial interests who needed the water navigation, were not acceptable to the ranchers and to the farmers who were upset by the flooding of their fields or their pastures, right? And it's a farmer who sues a hydraulic mining company that ends up with the federal decision called the Sawyer decision in 1884 that requires hydraulic mining companies to contain their debris. And so this is where students can start to understand the shifting economy of the late 19th century. An estate that's built on gold mining is now being challenged by the farmers, by the various agricultural interests who are saying you can't make it so that our businesses can't thrive, right? And so, of course, economic expansion will be an ongoing theme throughout this California unit, such with new industries that are developing, Hollywood, defense, aeronautics, computer technology, and they'll be attracting particular groups to California. These various industries reshape, and in the course of events, they'll be reshaping the culture of the state, its politics, and the very landscape. Just a nice image here of some of the other industries that are coming of age in the early 20th century. And ultimately, what we're hoping is that students are going to grasp what a dynamic state this is, how the continuous inpouring of people from around the world into an environment that is itself shifting all the time due to fires and earthquakes, droughts, floods, all of which are exacerbated by human impacts, will create complex experiences that require many different investigative lenses for the students to use to understand these. So we aim to provide students with nuanced historical content, certainly, that will enable them to view the past several centuries with complexity. But we also understand that the specific conditions that the students are going to come of age in, they will have changed. Their history, their present day will be different from what they're learning as they are growing up. And so we want to enable students to have the framework for understanding this interconnectedness of California's people, of California's environment, of its politics, of its economy, so that they can understand the significance of the synergy of all of those things for their own time when they are in charge of the state and running affairs. So that's a brief overview and of a way that we could get at a particular time period with the Gilded Age, and I hope that gives